Everyone loves to imagine Vikings as giant, horn-helmeted gym bros who solved every problem with an axe, which is adorable, because almost none of it is true. And trust me, the real stories get much dumber from here. 1. Charging into the scene like a cosplay enthusiast with no adult supervision, the horned helmet Viking bursts into popular imagination despite the awkward truth that real Vikings never wore anything resembling an elk-themed traffic hazard. And the actual archaeologists who keep repeating this fact now look like exhausted kindergarten teachers explaining for the 1,000th time that crayons aren't food. The myth traces back to a 19th century opera costume designer who apparently woke up one morning, glanced at a cow, and thought, yes, that belongs on a warrior's forehead. And from there, it snowballed into every Halloween aisle on Earth, trapping historians in a permanent loop of correcting people who genuinely believe Vikings walked around with two perfectly symmetrical handles that enemies could grab like a medieval steering wheel, which would have turned every battle into a competitive neck-yanking tournament long before swords were even drawn. 2. Kicking things off like a man auditioning for a werewolf movie, the legendary berserker supposedly transformed into an unstoppable animal-fused murder machine, a myth so persistent that people act shocked when told real berserkers weren't sprouting fur and turning into wolves, but were more likely high on a cocktail of exhaustion, hype, and whatever hallucinogenic plant their cousin swore was totally safe. And modern historians now find themselves explaining, with the patience of saints who absolutely hate their job, that berserking was a psychological frenzy, not a supernatural rage mode. Yet the myth survives because humanity loves the idea of rage-powered warriors more than the reality of sweaty men screaming motivation at each other until someone accidentally bites a shield, which, contrary to internet legend, does not grant temporary invincibility, just embarrassing dental bills. 3. Starting with the kind of heroic entrance usually reserved for shampoo commercials, the idea that Vikings were universally tall, blonde, blue-eyed supermodels refuses to die, even though genetic evidence and surviving descriptions insist their appearance ranged from rugged fisherman chic to man who has never met a comb. And historians have spent decades attempting to explain that Scandinavia, shockingly, did not run a medieval modeling agency. Yet, people cling to the blonde stereotype as if Vikings were an army of human golden retrievers, when realistically, half of them probably woke up every morning looking like someone who lost a fight with sea spray, cold wind, and the concept of personal grooming. And the funniest part is that many Viking warriors may have been shorter than the average medieval European, proving once again that history loves busting fantasies like an unlicensed contractor demolishing a dream home. 4. Bursting into the saga like a group of enthusiastic gym bros, the myth that Vikings were shredded, sculpted action heroes shows how deeply modern fitness culture projects itself onto people who, realistically, spent most of their day farming, rowing, and trying not to starve, which builds endurance, but not the kind of magazine cover abs Instagram insists they had. And historians now find themselves correcting people who imagine Viking battles as slow-motion Marvel fight scenes when the reality was closer to two exhausted men swinging metal at each other while sweating through wool, smelling like smoked fish, and praying their shield didn't give up on life. Yet the shredded warrior myth persists because humans desperately want historical warriors to double as personal trainers, conveniently ignoring the part where the typical Viking diet involved enough bread, beer, and salted meat to qualify as a Scandinavian buffet challenge. 5. Crashing into the narrative like a frat house on a field trip, the myth that Viking drinking culture was just one long mead-fueled party conveniently ignores that mead was expensive, beer was weak, and most Vikings were too busy not dying to drink themselves into heroic oblivion. Yet pop culture insists they lived in a permanent Oktoberfest with axes. Historians dutifully point out that alcohol was mostly a safer alternative to questionable water. But the myth survives because people love envisioning Vikings chugging tankards the size of toddlers while shouting dramatic toasts, completely forgetting that someone still had to milk animals, build boats, and avoid freezing to death. And no one accomplishes those tasks while blackout drunk, unless they're aiming for the world's most unnecessary Darwin Award nomination. 6. Entering with the swagger of a man convinced he invented boat travel, the myth that Vikings discovered America in a dramatic cinematic moment gets repeated without acknowledging that their discovery involved briefly showing up. deciding the locals were not impressed by their sales pitch and immediately leaving, turning the entire event into the historical equivalent of knocking on a door, hearing footsteps, and sprinting away. Historians have confirmed Vikings reached Newfoundland and even built small settlements, but the exaggerated version paints them as pioneering founders of the New World rather than awkward visitors who abandoned the project because North America refused to participate in their colonization fantasies, making this myth half-truth, half-premature victory lap. 7. Exploding into the story like a man who thinks thunder is applause for his personality. The myth that Vikings worshipped Odin by constantly summoning lightning or chatting casually with gods is a delightful exaggeration fueled by centuries of artistic overcommitment. Considering real Norse religion was less epic fantasy series and more, please don't ruin our harvest mysterious sky forces. The sagas describe rituals and sacrifices, sure, but not the cinematic god-summoning events Marvel fans imagine. And historians get stuck explaining that Norse spirituality involved practical concerns, seasonal rites, and a healthy fear of nature, not daily divine hangouts with a one-eyed deity who spoke exclusively in riddles and dramatic pauses, making the myth less religion and more an early example of wishful fandom. 8. Rolling into the conversation like a longship piloted by someone who refuses to ask for directions. The myth that Vikings were master navigators who used magical sunstones to track the sky paints them as human GPS units who never got lost, when the reality involved a lot of experience, some clever tools, and a generous helping of luck. But storytellers latched onto the idea of crystals that reveal invisible sunlight, because humans love pretending ancient people possessed mystical tech. And now historians must explain that while sunstones might have helped, Vikings also frequently miscalculated distances, hit storms, and ended up places completely by accident, proving they were more adventurous drifters than precision engineers. 9. Crashing into legend like a man who insists he could totally win in a fight with a bear. The myth that Vikings kept pet bears or wolves as emotional support animals pops up in modern imagination whenever someone wants to justify their edgy tattoo, even though real Vikings were practical people who understood that a bear cub eventually becomes a bear problem. While elite chieftains occasionally kept exotic animals as status symbols, the idea of Vikings casually strolling around with wolves like medieval Instagram influencers is absurd enough to make historians consider retirement, and the reality is closer to livestock management than fantasy companionship, meaning the only creature most Vikings tamed was the constant disappointment of daily survival. 10. Sailing into cliché like a man who mistakes looting for a personality trait. The myth that Vikings pillaged non-stop, 24/7, as if raiding were a full-time job with dental benefits, ignores that most Vikings were farmers who raided seasonally because bills existed even in the 9th century. The exaggerated version makes them look like adrenaline junkies sprinting from monastery to monastery for fun, while historians point out that the average Viking spent more time fixing boats, harvesting crops, and negotiating trade deals than swinging axes. Yet the myth endures because no one buys movie tickets for Viking Village, a story of crop rotation, which, although historically accurate, would bore audiences into several lifetimes of reincarnation. 11. Entering with the confidence of a man who believes deodorant is optional, the myth that Vikings were filthy, unwashed savages gets repeated constantly, despite archaeological evidence showing they were unusually well-groomed for medieval Europeans and owned enough grooming tools to open a pop-up barber shop, which probably annoyed their neighbors who preferred bathing annually, if at all. This myth persists because people love imagining warriors covered in grime. But the truth is, Vikings took hygiene seriously, washed more frequently than most Christian Europeans, and styled their hair and beards with the dedication of men preparing for a Tinder date, centuries before Tinder existed, creating the awkward situation where medieval English monks complained about Viking cleanliness as a competitive disadvantage. 12. Bursting onto the scene like a man convinced his poetry can fix a relationship, the myth that Vikings communicated exclusively in grunts and battle cries overlooks the inconvenient detail that they composed complex sagas, intricate poetry, and legal speeches that required more nuance than yelling "raid" at sunrise. Storytellers cling to the barbaric stereotype because it's easier to imagine Vikings as loud chaos engines rather than literate men who could weaponize metaphors in court disputes. and historians now spend an uncomfortable amount of time reminding people that these so-called savages produced literature so complicated. Modern English speakers sometimes need footnotes to understand it, which ruins the fantasy of Vikings as muscle-bound buffoons incapable of discussing anything more sophisticated than weapon maintenance. 13. Barreling into fantasy like someone who thinks medieval Scandinavia was a feminist utopia. The myth that Viking women ruled society with iron spears and unlimited freedom gets repeated by people who clearly skipped the context part of research. Even though Viking women undeniably had more rights than many European contemporaries, but were still living in a world where childbirth was a dangerous full-time occupation. The romanticized version imagines shield maidens on every corner, dual-wielding axes between pottery sessions, while historians painstakingly explain that although some women likely fought, the sagas exaggerated these stories, and daily life was far less glamorous, involving domestic work, estate management, and occasionally telling a drunk relative to stop headbutting furniture, which is far less cinematic than fans prefer. 14. Arriving with the energy of a man who believes funerals are simply opportunities for pyrotechnics. The myth that every Viking funeral involved a flaming longship drifting majestically into the horizon persists, despite overwhelming evidence that most funerals were either simple burials or cremations on land. Popular imagination insists on the boat-burning spectacle because it looks fantastic on screen. But historians keep noting that setting an entire ship on fire and pushing it out to sea is logistically ridiculous, expensive, and environmentally questionable, even by medieval standards. And the reality involves more ashes in pits than boats on fire, meaning the iconic Viking funeral scene is less historical fact and more an ancient version of creative license run amok. 15. Rushing in like a man convinced his ancestors invented every modern convenience. The myth that Vikings created democracy, social equality, and proto-internet levels of communication oversimplifies a society that definitely had assemblies and legal processes, but also had slaves, blood feuds, and enough grudges to fuel several seasons of dramatic television. Enthusiasts claim Vikings invented everything from parliament to progressive politics, forcing historians to gently clarify that while Norse assemblies, things were impressive, they were less model of justice and more angry men debating while holding weapons. And although the system influenced later forms of governance, pretending Vikings were ancient social philosophers is the historical equivalent of giving your pet goldfish credit for inventing naval strategy. 16. Charging into the historical imagination like a man convinced he can talk to animals. The myth that Vikings trained ravens as tactical reconnaissance drones has spiraled into this charming belief that every longship came with a built-in goth bird who doubled as GPS. Even though ravens were mostly a symbol and occasional help, but not the feathery air traffic controllers some people want them to be. In reality, Vikings released ravens when they suspected land was nearby, which is clever but hardly the mystical Avengers-level surveillance system pop culture imagines. Yet people cling to the idea because the thought of a vengeful bird circling above a longship while delivering battlefield updates like a medieval Siri is somehow more appealing than accepting that Vikings also got lost, guessed wrong, and sometimes rode in the entirely wrong direction, proving once again that humans will always upgrade reality with features it absolutely didn't come with. 17. Entering the discussion like a man who just discovered the concept of branding. The myth that Vikings used rune carvings as magical spells for every situation, from winning battles to making stew taste better, has turned runes into the ancient equivalent of a cheat code menu. Even though most rune stones were commemorative messages, names, or declarations such as Bjorn owned this land before his cousin stole it, not personalized enchantments for boosting courage or improving charisma. But modern imagination refuses to accept that Vikings were not wandering wizards leaving magical graffiti across Europe, and historians must endlessly clarify that scratching symbols into wood wasn't a ritual summoning, but more like writing an aggressive post-it note. Yet people still insist runes possessed cosmic power, because believing in mystical alphabets seems far more exciting than accepting that ancient Scandinavians enjoyed leaving messages that were basically the Norse version of "I was here." 18. Storming into the myth pool like a man convinced he invented swimming, the claim that Vikings were ship-exclusive creatures who avoided water like cats in chainmail persists thanks to worlds where sailors apparently couldn't swim. Yet actual Norse sources show swimming was common enough that sagas bragged about men who could stay afloat longer than their rivals. Which makes sense because if your entire lifestyle revolves around boats and fjords, not knowing how to swim would be the career equivalent of a firefighter being afraid of ladders. Of course, people cling to the absurd version where Viking warriors drown instantly the moment their toes touch water, perhaps because it adds drama to shipwrecks, or because some filmmakers enjoy pretending Vikings were buff aquatic disasters who treated oceans like wet death traps. But the more realistic picture is a group of hardened northerners who understood that being good at floating was slightly more useful than screaming at waves. 19. Entering the cultural debate like a man who mistakes cooking smoke for personality, the myth that Vikings ate nothing but endless piles of roasted meat as if every meal were a pre-battle barbecue, survives mostly because modern storytellers are obsessed with protein-heavy aesthetics, yet archaeological evidence paints a far less dramatic picture involving stews, grains, dairy, fish, and vegetables, which makes Vikings sound less like carnivore cultists and more like people who understood that fiber existed. Still, enthusiasts cling to the fantasy of warriors ripping into whole boars with their teeth because it reinforces the image of Vikings as unstoppable forces of nature, when realistically they were more like tired farmers eating porridge while complaining about the weather, proving once again that humanity prefers imagining history as a perpetual meat-eating contest rather than a time when seasoning options were criminally limited and dinner mostly involved whatever hadn't rotted yet. 20. Crashing into public imagination like a man whose only negotiation tactic is shouting louder, the myth that Vikings were incapable of diplomacy and resolved every disagreement with an axe is hilariously inaccurate, considering they traded extensively, formed alliances, brokered treaties, and managed complex networks of political agreements. But audiences prefer believing that diplomacy was simply a polite warm-up before the pillaging began, reducing Norse culture to a single emotional note: aggressive, loud enthusiasm. When in truth, Viking leaders often preferred negotiation because sieges were expensive, winters were long, and nobody wanted to waste manpower fighting a battle that could be solved with a gift exchange and a slightly threatening stare. Yet the myth survives because people adore the simplicity of a world where every meeting ends with a sword instead of a contract, inadvertently turning one of history's most adaptable societies into a caricature of perpetual rage. 21. Sliding into fantasy like a man who thinks wolves raised him, the myth that Vikings intentionally abandoned infants on cliffs to toughen them up has taken on a life of its own despite having the historical accuracy of a motivational poster written by someone who has never met a baby. In reality, harsh survival conditions existed, but Viking families valued children and invested heavily in them because small population groups don't casually discard future workers, warriors, or marriage alliances. Yet the myth persists because modern audiences love imagining ancient societies as brutal obstacle courses where babies were thrown into nature to earn their spot in the family. Which is ironic considering how carefully Vikings crafted clothing, toys, and protective charms for children, proving that the stereotype of unfeeling Norse savages owes more to creative exaggeration than anything resembling the cautious affection of people who knew winter could kill even the most adorable child. 22. Charging into the narrative like a man who believes violence builds community, the myth that Vikings used blood eagle torture routinely, slicing ribs open and pulling lungs through the back, has become so entrenched in modern imagination that historians now spend entire careers explaining. It was likely symbolic, poetic, or extremely rare, not a weekend hobby performed between raids. But audiences adore the gruesome imagery, because nothing screams epic barbarian culture like ritual anatomical origami, even though the sagas describing it were written centuries later with all the accuracy of a medieval tabloid, and the logistics alone make the act improbable, unless the victim conveniently agreed to stand still for several hours. Yet people cling to the spectacle because humans cannot resist exaggerating cruelty in societies they've already decided were savage, proving the blood eagle endures not because Vikings performed it, but because modern viewers enjoy being theatrically horrified. 23. Tearing into historical imagination like a man who thinks curses improve morale, the myth that Vikings believed every bad event was caused by shapeshifters, witches, or magical sea creatures reduces Norse cosmology to a supernatural blame game, when in reality their belief system was a blend of myth, ritual, and pragmatic acceptance that nature was rude and unpredictable. Sure, sagas mentioned supernatural forces, but Vikings also understood storms came from weather, not sea trolls with personal grudges. Yet storytellers continue portraying them as hyper-superstitious drama enthusiasts convinced every missing sheep was stolen by a vengeful elf, because this version makes for better cinema and conveniently removes the need to depict Vikings as thoughtful observers of their environment, which they were, even if sagas occasionally attribute misfortune to cosmic nonsense, because blaming unseen forces is a universal human hobby and not a uniquely Scandinavian pastime. 24. Crashing into legend like a man who's deeply committed to being wrong, the myth that Viking warriors always fought wearing animal skins, preferably something dramatic like a bear's entire upper torso, comes from artistic embellishment rather than archaeological reality. Yet fans adore the idea of fur-clad warriors stomping into battle like taxidermy runway models. In truth, wearing heavy animal skins into combat was impractical, hot, and likely to attract every stray arrow in the area, so warriors wore practical gear like wool, linen, and leather armor. But reality is far less cinematic than an army of men who look like they mugged a zoo, and people prefer the animal skin fantasy because it reinforces the idea that Vikings were dramatic performers who fought in outfits best described as nature-themed cosplay, even though their real battle attire aimed for survival rather than theatrical flair. 25. Entering the myth pile like a man who gets too excited about interior design. The claim that Viking homes were dim, smoky huts where families huddled in filth ignores the surprisingly well-engineered longhouses with ventilation systems, organized living spaces, and enough comfort to make neighboring cultures jealous. Sure, they weren't luxury condos, but the idea that Vikings lived like cave trolls huddled around a permanent indoor bonfire is just another attempt to paint them as uncivilized brutes, even though excavations reveal carefully built structures optimized for heat, storage, and daily life, making Viking domestic architecture far more sophisticated than the cartoonish version in which families sat in darkness inhaling smoke until someone keeled over, which might satisfy people who enjoy believing the past was uniformly miserable, but does no justice to a society that figured out insulation centuries before certain modern homeowners finally discovered weather stripping. 26. Storming into conversation like a man who believes funerals absolutely require fireworks. The myth that Vikings held constant, elaborate feasts for every minor achievement, as if their lives were one long medieval awards show, ignores that resources were limited and celebrations usually marked significant occasions, not every successful fishing trip. Yet, popular culture imagines Vikings eating, drinking, and shouting celebratory toasts 24 hours a day like Norse frat boys, when in reality those feasts were rare, meaningful, and often tied to religious cycles. But people prefer picturing Vikings as party machines with bottomless meat supplies because it fits the romantic fantasy that ancient warrior societies never worked, only celebrated, even though the truth involved more chores, planning, and rationing than any saga wants to admit. Proving again that mythic Vikings are everyone's favorite extroverts even when real Vikings were too busy surviving to throw daily banquets. 27. Charging into modern stereotypes like a man who thinks yelling "Skål" solves everything. The myth that Vikings spoke a single unified language, as if the entire Norse world agreed on one accent and vocabulary, erases the messy reality of dialects, local quirks, and regional variations that occasionally made people misunderstand each other, which is hilariously human but rarely depicted because storytellers prefer showing Vikings as linguistically synchronized shouting machines. In truth, Old Norse had significant differences across regions, and communication occasionally required guesswork, yet the fantasy persists because audiences adore a world where everyone sounds like they took the same language class from the same angry teacher, even though real Vikings probably had arguments over pronunciation long before anyone drew a sword, proving once again that linguistic chaos is not a modern invention, but a timeless human tradition. 28. Drifting into misconception like a man who believes meditation is improved by frostbite. The myth that Vikings routinely lounged in icy lakes as a spiritual practice ignores the reality that Vikings were practical northerners with a healthy respect for not dying of hypothermia. While they appreciated saunas and bathing, plunging into frozen water for enlightenment wasn't a cultural habit, but a modern fantasy built on the assumption that ancient people were immune to the effects of temperature. Yet storytellers keep depicting Vikings as cold-resistant superhumans who treated freezing conditions like a personality trait, when the real Norse response to extreme cold was layering up, staying near fires, and complaining about winter as passionately as any modern Scandinavian, making the myth less history and more an endorsement for extreme wellness influencers who would absolutely not have survived the 9th century. 29. Barreling into popular misconception like a man who mistakes embroidery for failure. The idea that Vikings didn't appreciate decorative or artistic detail has somehow survived despite overwhelming evidence of intricate carvings, jewelry, textiles, and ornamentation that would put many modern designers to shame. But people cling to the bare-bones aesthetic because it reinforces the barbarian stereotype, painting Vikings as too busy smashing things to enjoy beauty, even though archaeological finds reveal they adorned weapons, boats, clothing, and household objects with artistic flair that shows a well-developed sense of style, proving that minimalism wasn't a Viking ethos, but a modern projection by people who assume tough societies can't also enjoy fancy spirals, detailed knotwork, or impressive craftsmanship, all of which Vikings used to signal wealth, identity, and the universal human desire to make stuff look cool long before Instagram arrived. 30. Sailing into historical imagination like a man who thinks oceans are highways, the myth that Vikings constantly traveled everywhere, from Africa to Asia to the North Pole, has inflated their exploration achievements into a kind of medieval world tour sponsored by longships, even though most Vikings rarely traveled far from home, and only specific groups ventured widely. But because a few daring expeditions succeeded, people assume every Norse farmer casually zipped across continents on weekends, ignoring that distance, danger, and cost. Made major voyages rare, yet pop culture still depicts Vikings as tireless wanderers fueled by wanderlust and questionable maps, when the truth is far more grounded. Long journeys were strategic, difficult, and usually disastrous if mishandled, meaning exploration was impressive, but not the universal hobby fans desperately want it to be. 31. Crashing into the final myth like a man who believes fearless means brainless. The idea that Vikings had no fear at all, that they charged into battle with the emotional complexity of a brick, reduces an entire culture to a single facial expression, even though sagas and poetry explicitly describe anxiety, dread, strategic caution, and the kind of existential worry any sane person feels when holding a wooden shield against incoming iron. But fans prefer the stoic berserker stereotype because it's easier to imagine Vikings as walking embodiments of bravado rather than humans navigating danger, loss, and uncertainty. Yet historians keep reminding us that acknowledging fear doesn't make warriors weak, it makes them realistic, which is somehow less appealing than pretending ancient Scandinavia produced an entire population of emotion-proof action figures who never once questioned whether charging into a hail of arrows was, in fact, a questionable life choice. And that's our grand tour of Viking nonsense. Myths so wild, even the Vikings would roll their eyes. Drop your pick for dumbest myth below and stick around for the next disaster.